In the cold hallway of a private luxury hospital where everything ran on money and power, a single father had collapsed sideways on a hard plastic chair. His dress shirt was when Charlotte Bennett, CEO of one of the country's most powerful medical technology companies, walked past him that morning. She almost kept going. She almost did, until her gaze caught the patient identification bracelet circling his wrist. The name printed there stopped her cold. Not because of who he was, but because of who he had once been to her. What would you do if the person who once saved your entire world was lying there, forgotten by everyone? The hospital was called Meridian General, though general had long ceased to be an accurate description. It was the kind of institution that required an appointment just to schedule another appointment. A private facility nestled in the financial district, all glass facades and polished marble floors, where the ambient temperature was always slightly cooler than comfortable, as though the architecture itself wanted to remind visitors that warmth was earned, not given. The walls held abstract paintings in neutral tones. The receptionists wore tailored uniforms. Every surface gleamed as though it had never been touched by anything as ordinary as worry. Caleb Morgan had been sitting in the West Wing waiting area for the better part of 72 hours. He was 29 years old. Though that Tuesday morning he looked considerably older, not in the way that flatters men who age into authority, but in the way that life extracts a toll when it runs out of mercy. His button-down shirt had been ironed 3 days ago, before the call came, before he drove 4 hours straight with his daughter belted into the back seat while she struggled to breathe, before he checked her in and handed over every piece of documentation he owned and sat down in that hard plastic chair and simply didn't get up. There were rings beneath his eyes so deep they had become part of his face. A paper bag sat on the floor beside his shoes, stuffed with insurance paperwork, medical records, and a small purple stuffed elephant that belonged to Ella. Ella Morgan was 6 years old, and she was on the other side of a set of locked ICU doors 20 meters down the hall. She had been born with a congenital heart defect, a condition that had shadowed every milestone of her short life, every birthday candle, every field trip, every time she had run across a backyard and had to stop because her heart could not keep up with her legs. She was small for her age, with dark eyes that understood more than they should, and a habit of holding her father's hand even while she slept. Caleb did not pace. He did not make phone calls to relatives who might have comforted him, because there were no relatives to call. His parents had passed before Ella was born, and her mother had left when Ella was 14 months old, leaving behind only a forwarding address that stopped working 6 months later. He sat with the stillness of someone who had long since exhausted every alternative to patience. His hands rested on his knees. His eyes tracked the movement at the nursing station when the shift changed. He cataloged every face that came through those ICU doors, reading expressions before anyone could arrange them into professional neutrality, trying to understand whether the news they carried was the kind that ended things or the kind that merely delayed them. A nurse named Darlene, who had worked in cardiac care for 11 years and had learned to read a waiting room the way a sailor reads weather, brought Caleb a cup of coffee around hour 40. He thanked her quietly, holding the cup with both hands, though it had gone cold before he drank it. She offered him the blanket they kept behind the station for overnight families, and he hesitated before accepting it, folding it carefully across his lap as though it were something borrowed and precious. He had not asked for anything himself, not once. The other people in the waiting area had noticed him the way people notice weather. They would rather not acknowledge. His jacket fabric was technically good quality, but worn at the elbows. His shoes were polished but old. The staff had noted him too, not with hostility, not openly, but with that particular kind of attention reserved for people who might, at some point, cause an administrative complication. He had been awake, truly awake, for more than 60 hours. And he had not moved from that chair, because moving meant leaving the last place where he was still close to his daughter. Jason Reed arrived at the West Wing at 10:30 on Wednesday morning, wearing the precise expression of a man who had learned to turn discomfort into efficiency. He was the hospital's operations director, not a doctor, not a nurse, but something that occupied the space between administration and authority in a way that made him harder to challenge than either. He wore a lanyard with 3 separate keycards and carried a tablet in a leather case. When he walked into the waiting room, Caleb did not look up until Reed's shadow fell across his chair. Reed introduced himself with a handshake that was more identification than warmth, and then sat down beside Caleb with the settled posture of a man who intended to stay until the matter was resolved to his satisfaction. He explained, using the particular vocabulary of institutional care, that Ella Morgan's current placement in the ICU carried what he described as a significant daily overhead, and that it was hospital protocol to review the financial status of patients whose billing accounts had not been pre-cleared by an insurance carrier. He produced the tablet and tilted it toward Caleb, showing a figure in the amount column that occupied a full row of its own. Caleb looked at the number without flinching. He said, in a voice that was quiet and completely level, that he was aware of the cost. He had a partial coverage plan through his previous employer's COBRA extension, and the remainder was his personal responsibility, which he intended to handle. Reed nodded and asked whether Caleb had the liquid assets to cover the outstanding balance, noting that the hospital's financial assistance program had eligibility requirements that sometimes created delays of up to 10 business days. The implication was clear even if the language was not. Pay now, or start thinking about alternatives. Caleb did not raise his voice. He said that he had made a transfer from his personal investment account the previous afternoon that would cover the first 2 weeks of Ella's stay, and that he would arrange the remainder before that window closed. He said it the way a person states a fact they intend to make true by sheer force of will, without decoration, without performance. Reed tapped something on his tablet and said he would note that in the file. He stood, smoothed his jacket, and added almost as an afterthought, his tone perfectly calibrated to deniability, that in cases where long-term ICU stays were anticipated, the hospital sometimes found it beneficial to explore transfer options with partner facilities that had more flexible financial arrangements. He meant county facilities. He meant the kind of hospital where patients waited in hallways and cardiac monitoring equipment shared a floor with general medicine. Caleb said quietly that Ella would not be transferred. Reed gave a small, patient smile. The smile of a man who believed that people like Caleb eventually came around and walked back toward the elevator without looking behind him. For a long moment after he left, the waiting room felt different. The couple waiting for news had overheard and looked away with the discomfort of witnesses who were glad it wasn't them. Darlene, passing through from the nursing station, caught Caleb's eye and gave him a small nod that carried everything she wasn't allowed to say on the clock. 2 hours later, she returned with a second coffee and a package of crackers from the break room. She set them on the empty chair beside him without comment, without making it charity, without turning it into a moment he'd have to receive. Caleb ate 4 crackers slowly, drank the coffee while it was still warm, and then set the empty cup on the floor beside the purple elephant. From somewhere behind the ICU doors, a monitor beeped in a rhythm that, to his ear, meant Ella was still there. He had known people like Jason Reed his entire professional life, people who processed human beings the way a hospital processed invoices, in columns, in categories, with outstanding balances highlighted in red. He did not hate them. He had learned, somewhere in the span of becoming a father alone, that hatred was a luxury that burned through reserves he could not afford to spend. What he felt instead was something closer to a long, practiced recognition, that the system had been built without people like him in mind, that it would push until it was pushed back against, and that he would push back quietly and without flinching, for as long as Ella needed him to. Charlotte Bennett arrived at Meridian General at 11:47 that same Wednesday, traveling in the back of a black company car with a laptop open on her knees, and 3 unanswered messages from her legal team on her phone screen. She was 28 years old, and in the 3 years since she had assumed the role of CEO at BioSync Technologies, a medical AI firm whose diagnostic and surgical monitoring systems were installed in 47 hospitals across the country. She had to become accustomed to rooms shifting in her direction when she entered of them. Not because of beauty, though she was striking in the way that precision tends to be striking, but because of the particular energy of a person who never entered a room without already knowing what she intended to take from it. Dark hair pulled back, clothing chosen to project authority rather than warmth, posture that belonged to someone who had never been told to take up less space. The visit to Meridian was part of a quarterly review of BioSync's hardware integration across its hospital partnerships. Their surgical monitoring software, a real-time AI system that tracked vitals, flagged anomalies, and interfaced directly with operating room equipment, had been live at Meridian for 14 months. Charlotte had questions about adoption rates, staff training compliance, and a reported interface lag in the cardiac surgery wing that her engineering team had not yet been able to replicate internally. She walked through the lobby with 2 members of her team behind her, her eyes moving efficiently over everything without landing on anything for longer than it took to classify and dismiss. It was the absence of movement that made her notice him. Among the ambient restlessness of the waiting room, the couple shifting in their seats, the family crowding around a shared phone screen, there was one figure who was entirely still. Caleb sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes half closed, his head drooping toward his left shoulder in the boneless way of someone who had finally lost the battle against sleep. His paper bag sat on the floor. The purple elephant sat on the armrest beside him. Charlotte's first reaction was not sympathy. It was a kind of low-grade irritation, the instinctive response of a woman who ran organizations and believed, as a core operating principle, that public spaces reflected the standards of the people responsible for them. She made a note to raise the issue with facility management, then signaled one of the security guards and asked him quietly to confirm that the gentleman sleeping in the waiting area was a registered family member. The guard touched Caleb gently on the shoulder. Caleb stirred immediately, not with the disorientation of a deep sleeper, but with the sharp, fragmented awareness of someone whose body had been on alert even while unconscious. His eyes opened. His hand moved automatically to the paper bag beside him, and in that movement, his left sleeve pulled back. Charlotte had already started to turn away, but something caught, a small strip of white and blue plastic against the inside of his wrist. She turned back, walked toward the chair, stopped 2 feet from it, and looked down at the bracelet. She read the name. The identification bracelet was standard hospital issue, a white plastic band printed with a barcode, a room number, and a name. Morgan, Caleb. Family of Morgan, Ella. ICU 114. The letters were small, precise, generated by a machine that did not ascribe meaning to what it printed. But reading them, Charlotte felt something she had not felt in a professional context in years: genuine disorientation, the sensation of a floor that had been solid one moment, and suddenly was not. She stood very still, which was unusual for her. Her team knew her as a woman who processed information while moving, who made decisions on the walk between rooms, who treated stillness as a form of waiting and waiting as a form of loss. But she could not move, because the name on that bracelet had reached through 3 years of accumulated professional distance and pulled something loose in her chest. The memory arrived the way real memories do, not as a clean sequence, but as sensation first. The feeling of a phone call at 2:17 in the morning, the particular quality of silence in a hospital waiting room, exactly like this one. Her mother's hand cool and still, on the other side of a glass partition. 3 years earlier, Charlotte had been 25, newly promoted, operating on the premise that excellence was its own protection against loss. Her mother, Susan, had been admitted for what was described as a routine cardiac ablation, a procedure with a 92% success rate, performed at a facility that used BioSync's first-generation monitoring software. Charlotte had reviewed the hardware specifications herself. She had trusted the system because she had helped build it. What she had not known was that a firmware update pushed 48 hours earlier had introduced a conflict in the signal pathway between the primary cardiac monitor and the anesthesia dosage regulator. The conflict did not trip any visible alarms, but it caused a 60-millisecond delay in the relay of arrhythmia data to the attending physician, which meant that when Susan's heart went into ventricular fibrillation during the procedure, the alert arrived not immediately, but 60 milliseconds too late to initiate the standard response sequence in time. 60 milliseconds. The margin between the world Charlotte had lived in until that moment and a world without her mother in it. Susan had survived. Not because the system caught the error, because a systems engineer named Caleb Morgan, monitoring the firmware rollout from a remote terminal at 2 in the morning, had seen the relay conflict in the data logs before the surgical team had registered anything unusual. He had escalated the issue through 4 layers of overnight IT support in under 90 seconds. The operating room had been alerted. The team had responded. Susan's heart had been stabilized. Charlotte had been told about the error afterward, in careful, liability-conscious language, but had never been told the name of the person who found it. She had asked. The information had been described as handled by the engineering team. She pressed further and received a form letter about BioSync's quality assurance protocols. She had eventually let it go because she had a company to run and a mother who had lived, and the need to know the name of a quiet person in a dark office at 2 in the morning had eventually been overwritten by everything else. But the name had never entirely left. It had lived in a corridor of her memory she rarely walked down, in the category of things she owed that she did not know how to pay. She looked at Caleb, now really looked, not the quick classify and dismiss of the corridor, but the sustained attention of someone reassembling context. He was awake, watching her with the careful watchfulness of someone who had learned to wait for the shape of a situation before reacting to it. He had dark eyes, 3 days of stubble on his jaw. He was holding the paper bag against his chest as though it were the last thing between him and something he could not name. Charlotte said, very quietly, "Are you Caleb Morgan?" He said yes. She nodded once, turned, and walked back to the corridor. Her hands were not entirely steady. She would not have allowed anyone to notice, and no one did. She made 3 phone calls from the stairwell. The first was to her administrative director, requesting a full employment record query on the name Caleb Morgan, cross-referenced against BioSync's partner contractor files from the last 5 years. The second was to her head of legal, asking about the liability documentation from the November incident 3 years prior. The third was to Marcus, her senior team member, to say she would be late to the meeting with the department head. The records came back in just under 20 minutes. Caleb Morgan, systems engineer, biomedical AI integration, previous contractor affiliation with BioSync Technologies through a third-party engineering firm called Absalon, assigned to the firmware rollout support team in the 4th quarter of 3 years ago. No formal recognition on record. No incident report under his name. His contractor engagement had ended at the conclusion of that quarter's project cycle. As standard, he had left the field entirely 2 years ago. Not a career change, but a disappearance from the professional register. No new employer on file. No updated professional profile. The file ended cleanly, as files about people who step out of systems tend to do. A last date of engagement, and then white space. She knew, in the abstract way, that CEOs understand their companies, that BioSync's third-party contractor management had historically prioritized cost efficiency over continuity. Engineers came in for a project, delivered, and were released. If someone in a dark office at 2 in the morning pulled a thread that saved a life, that contribution would be logged somewhere in a server and never attributed to an individual name. The system was not designed to remember people. It was designed to complete tasks. She walked back to the West Wing more slowly than she had left it. Caleb had not gone back to sleep. He was sitting in the same position, eyes open, tracking the ICU doors, holding a multi-page medical form and reading it with the focused, undistracted attention of someone who had read it before and was checking it again not because he had forgotten, but because he needed to be certain. Charlotte watched the way his hand held the paper without shaking, the way he did not look at the exit, because there was no world outside that ICU for him right now. She tried to locate the irritation she had felt earlier, the reflexive categorization, the clean, efficient judgment of a CEO reviewing a room. She found only its absence. In its place was something considerably more uncomfortable, the recognition that she had walked past this man and processed him as a problem to be managed, and that in doing so she had been wrong in a way that revealed something about the architecture of her own assumptions. Dr. Adrian Cole was 51 years old and had been practicing pediatric cardiac surgery for 19 of them. When he came through the ICU doors that Wednesday afternoon and sat down across from Caleb in the chairs along the wall, he was holding nothing, which in the language of attending physicians meant the news was either very good or too complicated for bullet points. He explained Ella's condition with the precision of someone who had had this conversation many times and had never found a way to make it easier. The defect, a hypoplastic valve structure combined with a septal anomaly, had been managed conservatively since her diagnosis at age 2, but the most recent imaging showed a deterioration pattern that had accelerated over the last 3 months. The window for surgical intervention was not indefinite. The repair procedure, a complete intracardiac reconstruction, was technically complex and carried real risk, but the risk of not performing it had become, in his clinical assessment, the greater danger. Caleb listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions, all technical, all precisely targeted about the specific surgical approach, about post-operative monitoring protocols, about a recent published study on outcomes for Ella's particular defect profile that Dr. Cole confirmed he was also aware of. They were not the questions of a frightened layperson grasping for reassurance. They were the questions of a man with a biomedical engineering background who had spent 2 years reading every piece of literature he could find on his daughter's condition, and who was now stress-testing the information against a specialist who might know something he didn't. Dr. Cole answered them with the respect one gives to someone who has done the reading. Then they talked about money, the full cost of the procedure, operating room time, perfusionist fees, post-operative ICU management, and the hardware-intensive monitoring requirements, specific to pediatric cardiac cases, came to a figure in the low $100,000s. Insurance would cover a portion. The gap was significant. Caleb said he had been liquidating assets for the past 8 months in preparation for this possibility. He named a number he had available, real money, that had cost him his retirement account, his car, a piece of land inherited from his father. Dr. Cole looked at the number and did not say it was enough, because it wasn't quite. He mentioned the hospital's charitable assistance fund for pediatric cases. The application process took approximately 7 to 10 business days. Caleb thanked him and said he preferred to handle the full cost himself. Charlotte had been standing near the nursing station during this entire exchange. She heard the number Caleb named. She heard the number that wasn't quite enough. She heard him refuse the assistance fund in a voice that did not waver, did not apologize, the voice of a man who had decided long ago that the last thing he would allow to be taken from him was the ability to provide for his own child without extending his hand for something he hadn't earned. She heard Dr. Cole stand and say he would be back in the morning. She heard the ICU doors close. She stood looking at the back of Caleb's head and thinking about 60 milliseconds, about a mother who was still alive, about the particular mathematics of what one person's quiet competence is worth to the people whose lives it saves, and about the fact that nobody in the system she had built and ran had ever thought to assign that worth a 2 number. She found a quiet conference room on the 2nd floor and closed the door. She had run BioSync since she was 25, a fact that the business press liked to use as a shorthand for ambition. What that narrative tended to omit was the reason she had taken the role with such ferocity in the first place. It was not, at the origin, about disruption or market share. It was about a night in November when she had understood, with the precision that terror provides, that the systems she helped build were not abstractions. They were the layer between her mother's heartbeat and the void. Her mother had survived. Charlotte had gone back to work the following week and pushed through a complete internal audit of BioSync's firmware deployment protocols. She had never discussed the incident publicly. The liability team had been very clear about what could be said and what could not, and Charlotte had found that the professional calculus aligned neatly with her personal preference. She did not want to talk about the night she had almost lost her mother to a 60-millisecond delay in a system she had signed off on. She had tried to find out who found the error, She had asked, and been redirected, and asked again. After the third attempt, a senior member of her legal team had explained, with the careful warmth of someone managing a liability exposure, that the contractor whose remote monitoring had flagged the issue had signed a standard non-disclosure agreement, and that formally acknowledging his role would require them to formally acknowledge that the incident had occurred, which was inadvisable. Charlotte had been 25 and had just almost lost her mother. She had let it go. She thought now about what that decision had actually meant. About a man who had stayed awake for 36 hours monitoring a firmware rollout because it was his job to make sure nothing went wrong, who had found the one thread in a system of thousands that was pulling in the wrong direction, who had escalated it in 90 seconds through 4 layers of half-asleep people, who had done the thing that mattered most without anyone knowing it had been done, and who had then walked out of the building at the end of the quarter into a life that BioSync had never once thought to follow up on. She sat in the conference room for 11 minutes. Then she stood, straightened her jacket, and walked back to the elevator. She found Jason Reed in the administrative corridor near the East Elevator Bank and told him she needed 5 minutes. In the side office, without sitting down, she told him that the patient in ICU 114, Ella Morgan, age 6, pending cardiac surgery, was not to be considered for transfer under any circumstances, and that any financial review or administrative process initiated in connection with the Morgan case was to be suspended effective immediately. Reed said carefully that he appreciated her concern, but that the hospital's financial sustainability protocols required them to maintain certain standards around patient billing assurance, and that he had been acting within the bounds of established procedure. Charlotte said she understood that, and that it was a very clean answer. Then, she told him she was exercising BioSync's contractual seat on Meridian's Operations Advisory Board, a clause in the partnership agreement that had never been invoked before to formally request a hold on any patient transfer or billing-related discharge proceedings for any patient currently awaiting time-sensitive surgery, pending a review of the advisory board's standards guidelines. She said the review would take approximately 48 hours, which was coincidentally exactly the window that Dr. Cole had outlined for surgical scheduling. Reed's expression did several things in quick succession. He said he would need to consult with hospital legal before acknowledging the invocation of that clause. Charlotte said she was happy to wait while he made the call. He made the call. It took 6 minutes. When he ended it, his expression had settled into something that was not exactly defeat, but shared most of its characteristics. He said the hold would be noted. He said the Morgan case would be flagged as under advisory review. He said it in the language of procedural compliance, which was the only language he had, and which Charlotte had learned to understand as an entirely adequate form of surrender. She thanked him with the precise warmth of someone who does not need warmth to be taken seriously, and walked back into the corridor, where she picked up her phone and told Marcus she would not be leaving the hospital that evening. The surgical team was scheduled to begin at 6:40 the following morning. Dr. Touth Cole had moved quickly, reclassifying Ella's case from scheduled elective to urgent non-elective, a move that effectively bypassed 3 of the 4 administrative holds that billing could have placed on the procedure. Caleb had been told at 9 the previous evening that surgery would proceed in the morning. He had sat very still when Dr. Cole told him, then stood and shaken the doctor's hand with both of his own, not with the loose-limbed relief of someone whose worry had been resolved, but with the careful, gripping gratitude of someone who understood exactly what was being extended and did not take it as anything less than it was. Charlotte stayed through the night. She slept for perhaps 3 hours in the administrative office with her coat across her shoulders, which was 2 hours more than Caleb slept. At 5:45, she was in the corridor outside the cardiac operating suite, watching the pre-op team move through their setup checklist through the small window in the OR door. Ella had been brought in at 5:30, sedated and small and impossibly still on the surgical table, her dark hair fanned out against the white pillow. Caleb had walked with the gurney to the restricted access point and then stopped, because that was as far as they would allow him. Charlotte had seen his face at that moment from 40 feet away, and she had looked away because some things are not for observers. The surgery began on schedule. BioSync's surgical monitoring suite was live on screens along the OR wall, displaying a continuous feed of cardiac metrics, anesthesia levels, and procedure timing. It was at hour 2, 12 minutes into the intracardiac repair phase, that Marcus appeared at Charlotte's shoulder. He said it quietly, in the tone he used when something required immediate attention but public alarm would not help. The primary surgical monitoring interface had thrown an error, not an alarm, not a flagged anomaly in the patient data. Ella's vitals were stable. The error was in the interface itself, a display conflict between the hemodynamic monitoring layer and the real-time imaging overlay, which had caused the two feeds to desynchronize by an interval the system could not self-correct. The operating team was working from their secondary displays, which were functional but partial. They were missing the integrated view that Dr. Cole's team relied on to time the most delicate phase of the repair. Charlotte moved immediately to the monitoring control station in the corridor outside the OR. Two of BioSync's on-site technicians were already there pulling up diagnostic logs. One of them, a competent engineer named Priya, who had been with BioSync for 2 years, was cycling through error pathways with focused urgency, but her face held the tight expression of someone who had found the symptom and not yet found the cause. The error was deep in the interface stack, in a layer that required not just diagnostic access, but a working knowledge of the original system architecture, the specific way the components had been built to communicate, what trade-offs the original engineers had made. It was not knowledge Priya had. It was not knowledge any of the current BioSync team had, because the relevant sections of the interface stack were legacy code from the original build, and the original engineers had long since turned over. Charlotte stood at the monitor and felt the specific weight of a problem she had no technical solution to. She knew the error represented a gap her engineers were not equipped to close in the time available. She knew the Dr. Cole was at the most complex point of Ella's repair, and that the partial display had reduced his situational awareness by a margin that was not catastrophic, but was not nothing. She thought about the date on the firmware update from 3 years ago. She thought about 90 seconds and 4 layers of overnight IT support. She thought about a man in a waiting room who had spent 2 years out of the industry but had spent the 2 years before that doing nothing except building and maintaining and understanding systems like this one from the inside out. She told Marcus to get Caleb Morgan. Marcus found him exactly where he had been for the last 63 hours, seated in the West Wing waiting area, his hands on his knees, his eyes fixed in the direction of the cardiac O. When Marcus said his name and said he was needed upstairs, Caleb was on his feet in the same motion. He asked, "Is she stable?" Marcus said yes, vital stable, but there was a system issue that needed immediate attention. Caleb picked up the paper bag without thinking, then set it back down, and came. He was moving before the elevator doors had fully opened. Charlotte was at the monitoring station when he came through the corridor, still in his wrinkled shirt, still with the stubble and the exhausted eyes, but something had shifted in him the moment he stepped off the elevator. Something in his posture, in the set of his shoulders, in the quality of attention he was bringing to the space around him. He was not the father in the waiting room anymore. He was something else, something older and more assured, and Charlotte recognized it immediately, because she had seen it before in the rooms where people operated at the edge of their actual capability. She gave him 30 seconds of context. Interface desynchronization in the hemodynamic and imaging overlay layers. Legacy architecture code in the integration stack. Current team, unable to trace cause in available time. Dr. Cole working from partial display in the middle of the repair. Caleb sat down in front of the diagnostic console without waiting for anyone to offer the chair. He pulled up the error log and began reading it with the speed of someone who was not searching for the beginning. He had scanned the structure of the log in the first 4 seconds and understood where the error was located. His hands moved to the keyboard, not fast in the way that performance looks fast, not with the demonstrative urgency of someone being watched, but in the quiet, efficient way of someone who has traveled this path before and knows exactly which turns to take. He spoke once, to himself, a single word. very quiet. The name of a function in the interface stack. The way a person says a word when they've found what they were looking for. Then, he was rewriting a query at the base of the integration layer. Not patching over the error, but going into the structure where it lived and correcting the underlying conditional that had caused the desynchronization in the first, pre-plus. It was the architectural fix, the one that required knowing not just what the system was doing, but what it had been designed to do, and where the design had assumed a condition that no longer held. 4 minutes and 31 seconds. That was how long it took from the moment Caleb sat down to the moment the primary display above the OR came back online. Both feeds synchronized, the integrated hemodynamic imaging view returning to Dr. Cole's monitor in full resolution. No one in the observation corridor said anything for a moment. Then Priya exhaled a long, slow breath she appeared to have been holding for the entire duration. One of the other technicians leaned back and pressed his palms to his eyes. Charlotte stood very still, watching the clean feed of Ella Morgan's cardiac metrics moving in steady, measured lines across the screen. Caleb did not lean back. He stayed at the console, reading the output data to confirm that the fix had held. He checked the log twice. Then he stood, stepped back from the console, and looked at the OR window. Through the glass. Dr. Cole was working. His hands were steady. The integrated display was live. The repair was in progress. Caleb pressed both hands flat against the observation window, not pushing, not leaning, just resting, and closed his eyes. His forehead dropped slowly to the glass. He stayed that way without moving, and Charlotte understood, without needing to be told, that in this moment he was not a systems engineer who had just corrected an interface fault. He was a father who had just done the only thing left that he was able to do for his daughter, and now all he could do was wait. She did not say anything. She stayed in the corridor at a respectful distance, and she let him have the window. The repair took 3 hours and 17 minutes total. Dr. Cole came out of the OR at 10:23, removed his surgical cap, and sat down in one of the corridor chairs with the long exhale of a man who had been at precise, unrelenting attention for more than 3 hours and was now allowing his body to return to something approaching normal. He looked at Caleb, who was standing 5 feet from the OR door. He said, "She's stable." 2 words, the most complete sentence in the language of parents who have been waiting. Caleb sat down. He did not collapse. He sat down deliberately, placed his hands on his knees, and bent forward with his elbows on his thighs and his face in his hands, and stayed there without making a sound. His shoulders rose and fell, with a breath that was too deep and too slow to be anything other than the release of something that had been held for a very long time. Dr. Cole gave him a moment. Then he said that Ella would be in the recovery suite for several hours, that the repair had been clean, that the hemodynamic readings were exactly where he wanted them, and that she would need careful monitoring for the next 48 hours, but that the structural correction was solid. He said, with the quiet directness of a surgeon who means what he says, that he expected her to wake up. Charlotte had stayed in the corridor, far enough back to not intrude, watching Caleb receive the news that his daughter was alive. The nurses moved through the hallway with the efficient tenderness of people who had seen many of these moments and understood that the family member sitting in a chair with their face in their hands was not a logistical element, but the entire point of the work. Darlene, who had been on shift since early morning, paused near Caleb's chair and rested her hand briefly on his shoulder as she passed. He did not look up, but his hand moved to cover hers for just a moment before she continued down the corridor. Charlotte leaned against the wall and let herself feel the full weight of the last 36 hours. 36 hours was a recurring number in her life. It was what Caleb had stayed awake 3 years ago to monitor a firmware rollout that nobody had asked him to care about beyond the scope of his contract. 36 hours was what it had taken, in 2 completely different hospitals, to move from crisis to the particular quality of relief that can only be felt after surviving something you weren't sure you would survive. Caleb eventually lifted his head. His face was calm in the way that things are calm after a storm has moved through them. the quiet of a space that has been rearranged and does not yet know its own new shape. He looked at the hors door for a long moment. Then he looked up at the corridor ceiling, and Charlotte could see him breathing, slowly and deliberately, the way people breathe when they are trying to stay inside a moment that they know they will spend the rest of their lives remembering. She gave him an hour. She found him in the post-operative family waiting area outside the recovery suite, a smaller, quieter room than the West Wing, with better chairs and a window that looked out at a courtyard with a tree. He was in the chair nearest the window, the paper bag on his lap, the purple elephant held loosely in one hand in the absent, unself-conscious way of a person who has forgotten they're holding it. He was watching the tree. Charlotte sat down in the chair beside him. She had not brought anything, no tablet, no documentation, nothing that would make this look like a professional encounter, because it wasn't. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the courtyard for a moment before she spoke. She said, "You don't know me." He turned. His expression was attentive, but unguarded, the first time she had seen his face without the particular alertness of someone braced for difficulty. She said, "3 years ago, you were working a remote overnight monitoring shift on a firmware rollout for a hospital in the city. There was a conflict in the cardiac monitoring system. You caught it in 90 seconds and escalated it through 4 layers of support before the surgical team registered an anomaly." A pause. She watched his face. Recognition moved across it, not dramatic, not sudden, but a slow and careful arrival. She said, "The patient was my mother." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very simply, "I didn't know her name." "I know," Charlotte said. "No one told you. No one told anyone." She paused. "I tried to find out who found the error. I was told it wasn't documentable." Caleb looked at the elephant in his hand. He turned it once, studying the small purple face with its button eyes, and then looked back at the window. He said, "Is she all right?" "Your mother?" "She is," Charlotte said. "She gardens. She makes very strong coffee. She asks me why I work too much." The last part came out with an edge of something that was not quite humor but lived next door to it. Caleb nodded, just slightly, as though this confirmed something he had simply needed to know and now knew. Charlotte said, "I want to offer you something, and I want to be clear about why." She told him about the systems integration role she had been trying to fill for 8 months, a senior engineering position at BioSync, working on the next generation of the surgical monitoring platform, the exact system he had just repaired, the system whose architecture he knew better than anyone currently on her team. She told him the salary. She told him the benefits structure, which included dependent care coverage that was comprehensive and did not require a network pre-authorization for pediatric specialists. He listened to all of it. Then he said no. She had expected this, and she waited. He looked at the window again, at the tree in the courtyard, at the pale morning light coming through the glass, and he said not to her exactly, more to the space between them, that Ella came out of surgery today, and he wasn't going to make any decisions today. He said that when Ella was well enough, when he had slept for more than 3 consecutive hours, when the world had the ordinary shape again that it hadn't had in several months, then he would think about it. Charlotte said that was reasonable. She sat with him for a few more minutes in silence. That was not uncomfortable. Then she stood, looked at him, and said in a voice that did not reach for ceremony or weight but carried both anyway, "Thank you for 3 years ago, and for today." He looked up at her. He said, "Thank you for Ella." She nodded. She put her hand briefly on the back of his chair, not on his shoulder, not reaching further than the space between them, just a small human acknowledgement at the edge of contact. Then she picked up her coat and walked out of the room. In the courtyard below, the tree stood bare against the gray sky, every branch precise and clear, the way things look after a storm has moved through and taken everything unnecessary with it. 3 weeks later, Caleb Morgan accepted the position.